在国际政治经济的舞台上，有些历史事件的真相往往被层层迷雾包裹，而亲历者的讲述则如同穿透迷雾的光束，让我们得以窥见事件背后隐藏的博弈与算计。今天我们要解读的这段视频，主角是享誉全球的经济学家杰弗里·萨克斯。他以亲身经历为线索，撕开了上世纪90年代苏联和俄罗斯休克疗法背后的温情面纱，揭露了美国如何以承诺为诱饵，完成对苏俄的背刺。从滞胀危机到债务重组，从波兰改革到苏联解体，萨克斯的讲述不仅是一段经济改革的复盘，更是一部生动的地缘政治教科书。视频一开始，萨克斯并没有直接切入苏联、俄罗斯这些敏感词，而是先从当下世界讲起。他用一个非常冷静，甚至略显沉重的判断开场。从技术术语来说，这是一个混乱的局面。他强调，当下世界的特征不是单一危机，而是危机叠加、困惑叠加、分歧叠加。这不是媒体常见的情绪渲染，而是一个在经济学领域深耕40多年的学者对全球系统性失衡的直观判断。萨克斯明确点出自己42年的从业经历，这并不是为了自我标榜，而是在为后续的历史回溯建立可信度。他说的不是道听途说，而是亲历其中。
And what a pleasure it is to be together. And I really hope we can have a dialogue also, so I can hear what's on your mind and questions and brainstorming together on the complexities of the world today, which is, in a technical term, a mess. We're really with more crises, more confusion, more disagreements than I can recall during at least my professional career, which is now 42 years of professional work in economics. Thank you for the reminiscences of 30 years ago, the start of the transformation. And I'll start back 10 years before that just for a moment, because I studied economics in the 1970s, and that was an era of stagflation as we have right now. High inflation and big shocks to output, and I thought that's a good thing to write a dissertation about. So my dissertation in 1980 was on stagflation and supply shocks, and my first book was called The Economics of Worldwide Stagflation, exactly 40 years ago this year. So I'm living a déjà vu from 40 years ago, because stagflation is back. So I've seen it before, and it gives me some thought. I didn't want to see it again.
萨克斯随后把时间拉回到他最熟悉的领域——滞胀。20世纪70年代的高通胀、低增长、供应冲击，与今天的全球经济高度相似，而且依旧影响着今天。他强调，当年的危机并非天灾，而是政策失误、人为选择的结果。这个判断对中国观众来说并不陌生，因为我们在分析美联储加息、全球金融动荡时，也反复强调一句话：很多所谓不可避免的痛苦，其实都是制度选择的后果。
Like the stagflation of the 1970s, so many of the causes of our crisis are human-made blunders and mistakes. We've done it again, and we should really learn better from the past. And the events of 30 years ago, those early days of transformation, also continue to have a big shadow on today in ways that I didn't expect. Because after I got involved with stagflation in the early 1980s, we had a terrible economic crisis worldwide in the 1980s, in the developing world, and in Central and Eastern Europe, of course. Big debt crisis that came in part from the end of that stagflationary period. you'll recall that because of the high inflation in the or maybe you won't recall, it's ancient history, but at the time of the high inflation of the late 70s and early 1980s.
为了让观众理解这场危机的来龙去脉，他特意引入了一个关键人物——美国联邦储备委员会前主席保罗·沃尔克。美联储将利率拉到 20%， 确实压住了美国的通胀，但代价是把债务危机输出到全球发展中国家，中东欧、拉美无一幸免。从中国视角看，这恰恰是美元体系最真实的一面。美国用本国政策解决自身问题，却让世界为其买单。萨克斯并不否认自己在这场危机中事业蒸蒸日上。萨克斯讲到他参与的第一个重要案例——玻利维亚。面对失控的通胀，他给出的核心方案不是私有化，不是自由化，而是直接否认债务。他解释了这一思路的历史依据：20世纪20至30年代的债务危机，最终都是通过违约、重组或取消解决的。这一经验非常关键，因为它构成了萨克斯后来所有改革建议的底层逻辑。如果债务问题不解决，任何改革都是空中楼阁。而这一逻辑也成为后续美国背刺苏俄的关键切入点，承诺债务减免，却最终食言。
After some failed attempts to control the inflation, finally the United States got a new governor of our central bank, the Fed, who was 2 meters tall and smoked big cigars, Paul Volcker, and he put interest rates up to 20% in the U.S., which was unprecedented. Through a deep recession, ended the high inflation in the U.S., but created a debt crisis worldwide. That made my career, I have to say. Thank goodness for Volcker and his big cigars, because many countries started to call and say, we have a big debt crisis. And in 1985, I went to Bolivia, which had a massive debt crisis and a hyperinflation as a result of the debt crisis, very classical. And I helped them to end the hyperinflation in part by repudiating the debt. And that was an idea that I took from the 1920s and the 1930s, so it was history repeating itself. And in the 20s and 30s, the debt crises were ended in part through defaults or renegotiations or cancellations of the debts, sometimes too late, sometimes only after World War II. But in any event, I took those ideas and helped Bolivia cancel its debts. And the
波兰的案例尤为典型。萨克斯描述了一个近乎传奇的夜晚，在烟雾缭绕的房间里，语言不通，靠翻译交流。他通宵写下改革备忘录。这份文件后来成为巴尔采罗维奇计划的基础。但更关键的不是计划本身，而是西方世界，尤其是美国，确实在波兰问题上兑现了承诺，取消了大约 60% 的债务，提供了金融支持。从博弈角度看，这是一笔标准的政治交换。波兰选择融入西方体系，西方则承担转型成本。这一点，萨克斯讲得非常清楚，也非常坦率。从博弈角度分析，波兰之所以能获得债务减免，核心原因在于其在冷战末期的战略地位。美国希望将波兰打造为中东欧地区转轨的样板，因此愿意通过债务减免等方式给予支持，帮助其顺利完成从计划经济向市场经济的转型，进而削弱苏联的影响力。这种以经济援助换取政治转向的模式，是美国冷战后期对外战略的重要组成部分。
In early 1989, I was called by an official in the Polish embassy in Washington who came to Harvard and said, we also have a debt crisis. Can you cancel our debt? And it was January 1989. And I said, I have to confess, I'm really on the side of solidarity. It's under, Lech Wałęsa's under house arrest, and there's martial law. I can't really help you. And he said he understood and called me back 4 weeks later and said, we're going to eliminate martial law. Now will you come? That was not my doing. It was just the matter of timing. And so I arrived in Warsaw on April 4th, 1989, the day of the signing of the Roundtable Agreement between the government of President Jaruzelski and the Solidarity Movement. And I became an advisor to the government and to Solidarity for a couple of months, and then after the June 4 elections in Poland, to the Solidarity Movement alone. And I'll say one word about shock therapy, which is that they asked, what should we do? We're broke, we're bankrupt, it's hopeless. I said, it's easy, your debt's going to be canceled, so don't worry about the debt. And they looked at me a little bit like I was crazy, which I probably was. But I was asked to write a plan for market economy. And it was in the apartment flat of a wonderful Polish leader named Jacek Kuron, who went from jail to become the Minister of Labor, and he was a close advisor to Lech Wałęsa. And so one night, I spent about 4 hours describing my idea of what a market economy reform would look like. And he didn't speak English, I didn't speak Polish, we had a translator. There was a lot of smoke, a lot of whiskey that he was drinking. And every few minutes he'd pound on the table, tak rozumiem, tak rozumiem. I understand. And at the end of this, at about midnight, he said to me, okay, you have to write this. Now, we need this in a memo. And I said, of course, Mr. Kuron, I'm going back to the United States tomorrow night, and I will send it to you by fax, at least within 2 weeks. No, tomorrow morning. It's midnight. And so we went to a kindergarten room with the manager of the Gazeta Wyborcza, and they had a new IBM laptop, which was brand new at the time that the US had given them, and I typed a memo all night, and at 7 a.m. gave it back to Kuron. How to make a market economy. So that was my all-nighter of writing this. If anyone's interested, I'd be happy to email it to you, because many years later, someone found it in the archives and sent it to me. So I actually have a copy of that all night. And that became the basis of the Walter-Owicz plan to an important extent, actually. And the idea was to make the currency convertible and open the borders to trade right away. That was the basic idea. And to back it up with two core financial steps. One was a lot of aid, and the key was something I recommended called the Polish Zloty Stabilization Fund, which was to give reserves for this new convertible currency. And the second was debt cancellation. And that theory became called the 7 postcards theory, because the night that the Mazowiecki came into power, there was a meeting of the OKP, which was the Polish, the Solidarity members of parliament. And they invited 2 speakers that night, outside speakers. One was Senator Dole, who was the US chief senator, and he was there representing President Bush. And they invited me to speak. And it worked out very well, because Senator Dole spoke first and said, the American people will do anything for the freedom of Poland. And then I stood up and I said, I agree with Senator Dole, and that's why I'm sure that America will cancel all of Poland's debts. And so I said, the way out of this is 7 postcards, 1 to each of the G7 countries, and tell them, thank you very much, but the Soviet-era debts are gone. And in the end, Poland got about 60% of its debts canceled. The last step was Germany, because Germany was very resistant to canceling debt, as you can imagine. It took Balcerowicz, I sent Balcerowicz a copy of the 1953 London Agreement between post-Nazi Germany and the West, canceling the pre-World War II German debt. And Balcerowicz handed it to Helmut Schmidt, who looked at it in the meeting and said, you know, you have a point. Ended up Germany supported the cancellation of the debt also. Not 100% as I wanted, 60%. So that was the origin.
萨克斯的讲述进入最关键的部分，苏联和俄罗斯的改革历程，也是美国背刺的核心剧情。萨克斯回忆，他被戈尔巴乔夫的顾问邀请，参与构想一个共同欧洲家园的未来。在那个历史节点，苏联主动解散华约，接受德国统一，并得到一个明确承诺：北约不向东扩张。注意，这不是误会，不是口头寒暄，而是一整套谈判框架下的政治共识。从地缘政治角度来看，这一协议是冷战结束的核心条件之一。苏联以解散华沙条约组织，放弃对中东欧地区的控制为代价，换取北约不东扩的承诺，从而实现欧洲的和平转型。对于戈尔巴乔夫而言，这一协议是苏联融入欧洲、实现经济发展的重要前提，但对于美国而言，这一承诺从一开始就可能带有欺骗性，其真实目的是通过和平手段瓦解苏联阵营，进而实现单极霸权。
But it's worth all this reminiscing, I hope, to make a geopolitical point, which is that after that happened, I was asked by Grigory Yavlinsky, who was advisor to Gorbachev, to help President Gorbachev in 1990. And I believed that Gorbachev's idea, what he called the common European home, was exactly the right idea for Europe and for the Soviet Union. This is before the end of the Soviet Union. But Gorbachev said we should have a democratic Soviet Union, and it should be completely open, and we should have a peaceful European home, in fact, that stretches from Rotterdam to Vladivostok. I loved Gorbachev. I thought he was a man of incredible integrity and decency, basically, because he believed don't shoot people. This was his most core belief, don't shoot people. That was remarkable for a Soviet leader. It was the greatest statesmanship of the age. And so he, as you know, and Hungary led the way in every way, opening the borders and showing the different path. Gorbachev said, we will dismantle the Warsaw Pact. And it happened at the time that Helmut Kohl and Hans-Dietrich Genscher and George Bush and James Baker said, whoa, that's good. That's big. If you do that, we won't move NATO 1 inch eastward. And so a deal was made in 1990. It's a very explicit deal. It's not just a conversation. It was actually a very deeply discussed and negotiated deal. So the deal was Warsaw Pact ended, NATO not moving at all, Germany reunified. And that was the deal, and I believed in that deal and believed in Gorbachev.
鉴于苏联的现状，萨克斯和同事为苏联设计了一个大交易方案，核心内容是戈尔巴乔夫将继续进行民主改革，西方将帮助苏联进行这种金融转型。这套逻辑在波兰已经被验证过，但结果呢？白宫直接拒绝，不谈、不帮、不出钱。这里的背刺意味已经非常明显。从中国观察者的视角来看，美国的这一行为绝非简单的政策转向，而是精心策划的地缘政治算计。当苏联展现出妥协姿态， 解散华沙条约组织后，其对美国的战略威胁大幅降低，美国也就失去了给予其经济援助的动力。相反，美国更希望看到苏联因经济崩溃而解体，从而彻底消除这个最大的战略对手。
And I recommended that the Soviet Union also get financial help because it was in a state of collapse, a failed economic system, a disastrous social conditions, and Gorbachev, of course, had borrowed a lot short term in the mid-1980s to try to prop up the system, and all of that debt was coming due, and oil prices had collapsed at the end of the 1980s. So the Soviet Union was in a very sharp, short-term financial crisis. So with Yavlinsky and some of my colleagues at Harvard, we wrote a document which we called the Grand Bargain, which was that Gorbachev would continue the democratic reforms and the West would help the Soviet Union with this financial transformation so that the economic transformation could take place. Interestingly, this was presented to the White House in April of 1991. It was based on the same principles as the Polish episode. It was completely rejected by the White House. We're making no bargains, we're giving no help, no financing for the Soviet Union, no nothing. And I was a little surprised. Gorbachev was a little more surprised. He came back from the G7 summit in Houston only to be abducted and kidnapped in that attempted coup that summer. He came back empty-handed. And that was the end of the Soviet Union and the end of Gorbachev. And
接下来发生的一切，历史早已给出答案。戈尔巴乔夫在政变中被边缘化，苏联解体，叶利钦上台。叶利钦政府再次尝试争取援助，但得到的回应是赤裸裸的威胁。萨克斯说出了整段视频最沉重的一句话：“我以为我们在做经济，但他们在做地缘政治。”俄罗斯阶段的经历让萨克斯彻底清醒，他一次次向西方争取债务暂停、财政援助，得到的却是赤裸裸的威胁：不还钱就断粮。这不是改革援助，这是极限施压。这一威胁彻底暴露了美国的霸权本质。对于刚刚独立、经济濒临崩溃的俄罗斯而言，食品运输和海上援助是关乎民生的关键保障。美国以此相要挟，本质上是强迫俄罗斯在经济上完全屈服。从博弈逻辑来看，美国此时的目标已经非常明确，通过经济施压，让俄罗斯成为新单极美国世界的一部分，丧失战略自主性。所谓休克疗法失败，并不是因为俄罗斯不够听话，而是因为这场改革从一开始就不是为了让俄罗斯成功。
Yeltsin's rise. And just to continue, because I'm going to come to the current moment in a moment. In September of 91, I got a call from Yegor Gaidar, who said, there's going to be an independent Russia. Come help Russia on the economic reforms. So I went back to Moscow, to a dacha outside of Moscow. Pretty run-down dacha, by the way. It showed this was an empire at the bottom. And we worked on a strategy. And at that time in November, the G7 finance deputies had a mission led by David Mulford to come to Moscow. And Gaidar, I coached him. You have to ask for a debt standstill, financial help, this, and this. And I remember he came out of the meeting looking terrible. And I said, what happened, Yegor? He said, not only did they say no help, but they said, if you don't pay every penny that's due, we will stop any help on the ocean, any food shipments, anything this moment. So he was given a complete hardline block. This was Russia, not the Soviet Union. This was Yeltsin coming to power in November 1991. Well, the reforms did not go.
萨克斯讲述了自己在俄罗斯2年的经历，他的角色是试图帮助获得西方的资金，俄罗斯方面也把他看作获得一些缓解的唯一机会，但最终一无所得。萨克斯自己也承认，他当时太天真了，他以为这是经济问题，结果发现这是单极世界的塑形工程。俄罗斯被要求的不是发展，而是被整合、被削弱、被驯化。这句感悟可谓一语中的。美国在波兰和苏俄改革中的不同态度，完美印证了这一点。波兰作为中东欧的样板，其改革符合美国削弱苏联的战略需求，因此可以获得债务减免和一定支持。而苏联俄罗斯作为美国的核心战略对手，即使主动妥协，也无法获得真正的经济援助，反而会被美国趁机施压，企图彻底瓦解其国力。
I lasted 2 years. My role was to try to help get Western money. I think they saw me as the only chance to get some relief. And I delivered zero, nothing. And I couldn't understand it because in Poland, I was saying to the governor and the deputy governor, everything I said they agreed to. And I kept saying, I'm so good. And then everything I said about Russia, they disagreed with. But it was the same thing and same advice. So it was geopolitics, which I didn't understand as a young person. I thought we were doing economics, not geopolitics. But they were playing geopolitics, I was playing economics. And so I was trying to give good economic advice. They were trying to basically make Russia subservient to a new unipolar American world. And I didn't understand it for a very long time. I resigned and was very unhappy and went to work on many other things with the UN and sustainable development and climate and other things that are really crucial. But till today, this geopolitical shadow also looms over.
这一点与后来中国面对的外部压力有着高度相似的逻辑结构，只是阶段不同，对象不同。在谈到当下世界时，萨克斯的语气明显发生变化，他不再讲历史细节，而是直接批判一种根深蒂固的美国心态：我们与他们。在这种思维下，气候变化、贫富差距、环境危机全都让位于敌人叙事，而当前被定义为敌人的正是中国和俄罗斯。从中国角度看，这段话并不是替中国辩护，而是点出一个全球治理的根本矛盾：当一个国家把所有问题都安全化、对抗化，世界就不可能真正合作。最后，萨克斯谈到可持续发展、联合国、多边合作，这一段看似理想主义，但结合他前半段的经历，反而显得格外现实，因为他亲眼见过，当大国选择背弃承诺、玩零和博弈时，结果是什么。
The U.S. is an us versus them world. This is the mentality. We run the world, you're with us, or you're on the other side. And it's a very tough, wrong vision of the world, because all of the real things that we need in this world need to be done collaboratively. They cannot be done under a Cold War. The climate crisis, the broader environmental crises, the global social crises are not Cold War issues, they're global issues. And so we need a completely different mindset from the mindset that we're having right now. And the biggest problem we have, in my experience, is the US mindset, which is that we're fighting a different battle. We're not fighting against climate change. We're not fighting against poverty. We're fighting against an enemy. Today, the enemy is China mainly and Russia, but it's always someone on the other side. And this is what I grapple with every day as the biggest challenge that I face in the practical work that I'm trying to promote. So for 22 years now, I've been advising the Secretary General of the UN, 3 Secretaries General, about the global scene and about the idea of sustainable development and sustainability. And sustainable development for me is a broader concept than environment. It's represented by both the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement and the Convention on Biological Diversity as the 3 big headlines. But the idea is a world of shared economic prosperity, social inclusion and reduced inequality, and environmental sustainability. And the environmental issues are 3 big issues. The human-induced climate change, the fragility and even collapse of many ecosystems, and the massive industrial pollution. Because all 3 are very much interrelated, and all 3 have to be solved by new long-term transformations of industrial technology and power sector technology. So for me, the sustainable development challenge is that broad challenge. And we're setting lots of goals, but not achieving very many of them because the world is constantly distracted. And especially, you'd be interested to know the United States government, for example, as a government, will not use the term sustainable development goals, even though every other country of the world does. There are 5 countries that have not had a voluntary national review of the Sustainable Development Goals. The US, South Sudan, North Korea, and I don't recall the other 2, but it's not great company, actually. So it's a real problem that we're fighting a Cold War for global dominance, and at the same time, what we really need is a global, coordinated, cooperative strategy to address these challenges.
对中国观察者而言，这段视频的真正价值不在于揭黑，而在于它从一个曾深度参与西方政策制定的人口中，完整呈现了一条逻辑链。规则不是自然存在的，信任不是自动生成的，合作一旦被当成工具，冲突就会成为常态。而今天的世界正在为30年前的那次背刺持续付出代价。